In the aftermath of war's devastation, where hatred and loss once ruled, American soldiers chose compassion over vengeance, rebuilding what had been destroyed. From ruins and grief emerged friendship, hope, and a lasting peace that turned former enemies into allies for generations. September 8, 1945, Yamada Village, roughly 30 kilometers northwest of Tokyo. 56-year-old Ichiro Tanaka huddled in the pitch of his family's root cellar. His wife Ko held their 2 grandchildren tight to her chest. Above them, through the slats of the wooden floor, the rumble of American trucks on the dirt road that ran through the village grew nearer. They had been in hiding for 3 days, surviving on pickled vegetables and cold rice. The children had fallen silent, too frightened even to cry. Ichiro pressed his ear against the damp earthen wall and listened. His hands shook. Not from age alone, though he was old enough to recall the Russo-Japanese War. Not from cold, although the September morning was crisp. He trembled because he believed he knew what would follow. The Americans had arrived. For 4 years, the government radio had painted a picture of what American soldiers would do. Burn villages, desecrate shrines, show no mercy to civilians, especially the old and the helpless and the children who were a burden. The Imperial Army had warned every village that surrender meant slavery or death. Ichiro had trusted those warnings. Why wouldn't he when his government had never deceived him before? His son had been killed on Okinawa fighting the same Americans. Newspapers had published images of Japanese cities torched, Tokyo, Yokohama, Osaka reduced to ash by American bombing. Leaflets dropped from American planes promised mercy, but Ichiro distrusted them. Tigers do not spare rabbits, he thought. Footsteps overhead, heavy boots on the wooden floor, and American voices booming in a language they could not understand. Ko squeezed her eyes shut and drew the children closer. Their 8-year-old grandson Hiroshi buried his face in his grandmother's worn kimono. Ichiro remembered fighting in Manchuria in 195, and the atrocities conquering armies visited upon villages. He had seen what befell civilians captured by enemies. Now 40 years later, he braced to experience the same from the other side. The cellar hatch creaked open and light poured down the stairs. This was the end, he thought. What happened next would upend everything he believed about Americans. The man at the top of the stairs was Private First Class Danny O'Brien of the 42nd Infantry Division, the Rainbow Division, 22 from Boston, Massachusetts, who had come ashore at Yokohama only 8 days before with the occupation force. Danny saw them at once, an old man, an old woman, 2 terrified children huddled like trapped animals in a dirt cellar. His Japanese was limited to a handful of words. Their English was non-existent, but he read Ichiro's face perfectly. The old man expected death. Danny did something that likely wasn't in any army manual. He smiled. Then he raised both hands, palms outward, and stepped back slowly 2 paces. He called over his shoulder, not shouting, just speaking to his squad leader. "Sarge, get a family down here. Old folks and kids. They're scared out of their minds." Sergeant Mike Kowalski appeared at the cellar opening. He was 31 from Chicago, a policeman before the war, accustomed to seeing frightened people and knowing the look. "Tell them nobody's going to hurt them," Kowalski said. "Get Chen up here." Private James Chen, a Chinese-American from San Francisco who spoke some Japanese, came down the cellar opening. In halting but understandable Japanese, he called, "Daijobu Anzen, please come up." "You are safe." Ichiro didn't move. Every instinct shouted trap. They'd be lured out and then shot or worse. But Chen kept speaking, repeating the word Anzen, safe, and finally said something that pierced Ichiro's terror. "Kodo waika gasuta disho." The children must be hungry. That cut through, because the children were indeed starving. With effort, Ichiro rose, his legs cramped from 3 days of crouching. He helped Ko up and lifted his grandson. Hiroshi was as light as a bird, too light. The boy hadn't had a proper meal since before the surrender. The climb up the cellar steps felt endless. With each tread, Ichiro expected a rifle butt to his skull. With each step, he feared he was leading his family to slaughter. He emerged into daylight in his own home and found himself surrounded by American soldiers. None of them held weapons on him. Instead, Danny O'Brien offered a chocolate bar. Ichiro stared at it as if it might explode. "For the kids," Danny said, gesturing, and unwrapped it himself, breaking off a piece and popping it into his own mouth to show it was safe. He held it out again. Hiroshi's eyes widened, chocolate, something he had never tasted in his 8 years. Japan had been at war since before he was born. Sugar had been rationed since 1943. Chocolate belonged to the world of American magazines. Ko looked at Ichiro. Ichiro looked at the soldier's face. Danny kept smiling, that easy Boston grin, and with the chocolate extended, Hiroshi reached with a trembling hand and took it. It was the finest thing he had ever tasted. News spread through the village in minutes. The Americans were not executing civilians, not burning homes. They were handing chocolate to children. By noon, 24 villagers came out from hiding, from cellars, stalls, from the forest, from the shrine where some had crouched behind the altar, and found Rainbow Division soldiers setting up a field kitchen in the square, cooking something that smelled better than anything Yamada had smelled since 1942. Sergeant Kowalski waved them over. "Sit down, eat. You folks look half-starved." It was army beef stew with real meat, potatoes, and vegetables from American supplies. For people living on rice and weeds, it tasted like heaven. Ichiro sat on a crate with a tin plate of stew and realized his hands had stopped shaking. Ko fed their granddaughter broth. Around them, American soldiers ate from the same pots. A tall red-haired private named Finnegan sat beside Ichiro and pulled a photograph from his wallet. A woman and 2 children outside a white house with a porch. "My family," Finnegan indicated. Ichiro did not need words to understand the gesture. This American was a father, a husband, a human being like him. Ichiro took out his own photograph, kept in a cloth pouch at his neck. His son in Imperial Army uniform taken before he shipped to Okinawa, before he died. For a long moment, the 2 older men, one American and one Japanese, regarded each other across the ruin of war. Finnegan bowed slightly, a small sign of respect. Over the following days, Yamada Village transformed in ways Ichiro had not expected. The Rainbow Division's orders were to establish a presence and help maintain order during the occupation, but Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, the battalion commander, interpreted those orders more broadly. "We did not come here to terrorize civilians," Harrison told his officers at a briefing on the 3rd day in the village. "These people have been beaten. They are scared. They are hungry. They have been lied to about us for years. Our mission is to show them what America actually stands for." What Harrison found in Yamada shocked him. The village school, a small wooden building where 60 children once studied, had been partially destroyed by an American bombing raid 6 months earlier. Roof collapsed, walls charred. Since then, the children had no schooling. There were no materials to rebuild, barely food to eat. Teachers had fled, books had burned. The children's future looked like endless rice paddies and backbreaking poverty. Harrison made a choice beyond his orders. He asked Kowalski, "Mike, how many carpenters do we have in the battalion?" Kowalski thought, "Maybe a dozen, sir. Lots of farm boys who know their way around a hammer." "Good, round them up. We're rebuilding that school." Private Danny O'Brien had worked construction in Boston's summers, helping his uncle frame houses. He never imagined those skills would serve in the army. He had spent his time digging foxholes, hauling ammo, and trying not to be killed. Now he measured lumber, cut boards, and Japanese men watched with baffled faces. Chen translated, "They want to know why you are doing this." Danny looked up from his saw. "Doing what?" "Building their school. They don't understand why American soldiers would rebuild a Japanese school." Danny thought of his sister, a 3rd-grade teacher back home, who always said education is the most important thing. Without it, kids have no future. "Tell them," Danny said slowly. "Kids need a place to learn. Japanese kids, American kids, and it doesn't matter. Kids are kids," Chen translated. The Japanese men exchanged looks. A younger survivor named Satoshi stepped forward and through Chen said, "We will help," and they did. What unfolded in Yamada over the next 6 weeks mirrored hundreds of similar efforts across occupied Japan, each with its own human details. In Yamada, those moments came quickly. Ichiro Tanaka, the old man who had hidden expecting death, became an informal bridge between villagers and Americans. Decades earlier, he had been a schoolteacher before being drafted for the Russo-Japanese War. Now he watched American soldiers and Japanese laborers working side by side to rebuild his old school. The Americans furnished more than lumber and nails. They brought laughter. Private Finnegan, the red-headed father, started a baseball game one afternoon with a stick and a wrapped cloth ball, teaching 8-year-old Hiroshi how to swing. "Keep your eye on the ball," That's it. Hiroshi didn't know English, but he understood baseball. By the second week, daily games filled the village square. American and Japanese children playing together while older villagers looked on, bewildered to see the enemy playing with their youngsters. Sergeant Kowalski taught basic carpentry to teenage boys who had been trained to mount a final suicidal defense of the homeland. Now they learned to build rather than destroy, to measure twice and cut once, to drive a straight nail. One 16-year-old, Kenji, who'd learned some English from a pre-war missionary teacher, asked the question everyone wanted answered. Why do you do this? We were your enemy. We fought you. Why help us now? Kowalski set down his hammer. War's over, kid, you lost. But that doesn't mean you have to stay beaten. My grandmother came to America from Poland with nothing. People helped her. Now I'm helping you. That's how it works. He acknowledged the dead on both sides, but insisted the war was finished and now they would build. The school's reconstruction took 6 weeks, and small acts of humanity accumulated into larger change. Example 1. The rice shortage. 3 weeks into the project, the village ran out of rice. The harvest was poor, and government supplies had dried up in the chaos after surrender. Families skipped meals so children could eat. When Harrison learned of it, he diverted a truckload of army rice to the village, enough for 2 months. The village elder, a 70-year-old named Yamada, bowed so deeply his forehead nearly touched the ground and through tears said in broken English, "We do not deserve your kindness." Harrison's reply, translated by Chen, was simple. Every child deserves to eat. That is not kindness. That is human decency. Example 2. The teacher's return. As the school neared completion, Ichiro asked Kowalski if the village's former teacher, Yuki Nakamura, who had fled to Tokyo during the bombing, could be brought back. Corporal Robert Martinez found her in a refugee shelter in Tokyo, teaching children in a bombed-out basement with charcoal on scraps of wood. "We rebuilt your school," Martinez told her through an interpreter. "The kids need you." Yuki returned to Yamada and wept at the sight of the new building. The Americans had not only rebuilt it but improved it. New desks shipped from army supplies, books collected by a chaplain from soldiers, a new chalkboard, operable windows. On a wall, Danny O'Brien painted a mural of Japanese and American children playing beneath a rainbow, the Rainbow Division's emblem. Example 3. The dedication ceremony on October 20th, 1945, the school's official reopening. 60 children sat on new wooden benches in clean uniforms the village had somehow scraped together. Their parents lined the walls while American soldiers stood at the back, caps on. Ichiro, who had hidden in his cellar 6 weeks earlier, stood at the front and spoke through Chen's translation. "For 4 years our government told us Americans were devils. They said you would kill us, enslave us, destroy us. I believed those lies. When I heard your trucks coming, I hid my family in the ground like rabbits waiting to die." His voice broke. "Instead, you fed our children. You rebuilt our school. You showed us the real evil was the lie itself. You have given our children a future. For this we have no Japanese words sufficient. We can only say Goas. Thank you." In the back, Private Danny O'Brien found something in his eye, probably sawdust, definitely not tears. Sergeant Kowalski didn't bother to hide his. The big Chicago cop stood there sobbing, unconcerned who saw. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison presented the school with an American flag and a Japanese flag to fly together, saying through Chen that those flags represented the past of war, while the school represented the future. Enemies becoming friends, soldiers becoming builders, children learning in peace. "This is why America fights," he said. "Not to conquer but to liberate, not to destroy but to rebuild." The ceremony ended with the children singing first the Japanese national anthem, and then halting and off-key, "You Are My Sunshine," taught to them by Finnegan. Afterwards, Hiroshi ran to Danny O'Brien and flung his arms around the American soldier's legs. No translator required. What occurred in Yamada was not happenstance but policy. Before occupation troops landed in Japan, General Douglas MacArthur had given clear instructions to every officer and soldier. "We come not as conquerors seeking revenge, but as victors seeking peace." Every act of kindness toward the Japanese people was intended to be an act of warfare against the militarists who had misled them. The mission was to demonstrate that democracy works not only as a system of government, but as a humane way of treating other people. This was strategic as well as idealistic. American military doctrine, shaped by leaders like Eisenhower and Marshall, recognized something many armies had missed throughout history: how a defeated foe is treated shapes whether you actually win the peace. The Geneva Convention set the legal baseline, but the American approach went well beyond mere law. It sprang from a deeper conviction. Every human being possesses inherent dignity and rights, no matter which side they fought for. Contrast that with Axis practices. Japanese POW camps in China and across the Pacific recorded mortality rates approaching 40%. German POWs held by the Soviets endured comparable devastation. The notion of repairing a vanquished enemy's school would have been unthinkable under those regimes. Yet many American soldiers came from families of immigrants and refugees who remembered being on the receiving end of charity. Kowalski's Polish grandmother, Danny O'Brien's Irish forebears who fled the potato famine, Martinez's Mexican relatives who crossed a border for opportunity. These backgrounds shaped how they saw people in need. For Ichiro Tanaka and the residents of Yamada, 6 weeks spent rebuilding a school demolished the image of America they had been taught to believe. In a diary later found in the family archive, Ichiro noted, "September 8th, the Americans arrived. We expect death. September 15th, they fed us. Why? September 22nd, they are rebuilding our school. Nothing makes sense. Our government lied about everything. October 20th, the school opened. I wept. I had forgotten hope. These Americans are not conquerors. They are teachers showing us how to live without war." Yuki Nakamura, the teacher brought back from Tokyo, wrote to a friend, "The soldiers who rebuilt our school were just boys, farm boys and city boys who wanted to go home to their mothers, yet they stayed and worked because they believed Japanese children deserved a future. I do not know why we merited such mercy, but I will spend my life trying to honor it." This change in outlook was not confined to Yamada. Across Japan, millions who had been raised to fear and loathe Americans found reality wildly different from propaganda. By December 1945, occupation forces had rebuilt or repaired over 2,000 schools in Japan, delivered millions of tons of food to stave off starvation, and provided medical care to hundreds of thousands of civilians. Japanese civilian mortality actually fell during the first year of occupation as American military doctors treated patients, engineers repaired water and power systems, and soldiers shared rations with hungry children. That stands in stark contrast to the Japanese occupation of China, Korea and Southeast Asia, where brutality, forced labor, and starvation killed millions, and to the German occupation of Eastern Europe or the Soviet occupation of Germany. The American occupation of Japan was not flawless. There were crimes and mistakes, but its dominant pattern was reconstruction rather than revenge. This was moral choice and hard-headed geopolitics. MacArthur and his staff grasped that Japan needed to become a stable democratic partner, not a festering sore that would spawn future conflict. They proved prescient. Within a decade, Japan rose to economic strength, and within 2 decades it became one of America's closest allies. The children who learned in that rebuilt Yamada school grew into participants in Japan's post-war recovery, and many retained vivid memories of the soldiers who had shown them compassion when they expected only brutality. Ichiro Tanaka lived to 87 and returned to teaching in the very school American soldiers had rebuilt. He maintained a correspondence with Sergeant Mike Kowalski, Christmas cards exchanged for 35 years until Kowalski's death in 1980, and though they never reunited in person, their bond endured. In 1985, on the 40th anniversary of the school's reopening, Ichiro told a Japanese newspaper that what he remembered most was Private O'Brien's smile. When he offered that chocolate bar to my grandson, Ichiro said, the smile said, "You are human and so am I. We will survive this together." That smile saved more than my life. It saved my soul. Hiroshi, the 8-year-old who had hidden in the cellar, tasted chocolate for the first time, learned baseball from an American soldier, and later became an English teacher who introduced thousands of Japanese students to American culture, values, and kindness. He visited the United States in 1995 and met Danny O'Brien, then 72 and retired from construction. Standing in O'Brien's backyard, Hiroshi thanked him in perfect English. Thank you for teaching me that enemies can become friends. Danny, still wearing that Boston grin, answered, You taught me the same thing, kid. Yuki Nakamura taught for 43 years in the rebuilt school and retired in 1988. The village marked the occasion by mounting a plaque on the wall. This school was rebuilt in 1945 by American soldiers of the 42nd Infantry Division, the Rainbow Division, and the people of Yamada Village, working together to build peace from the ashes of war. Yamada's story is one among thousands. Scale that across occupied Japan, occupied Germany, and the Marshall Plan's rebuilding of Europe, and a pattern emerges. American post-war policy toward defeated powers was transformative. Rather than extracting reparations that would cripple economies as after World War I, the United States invested billions in reconstruction. The Marshall Plan and the occupation of Japan were not mere charity. They were strategic investments in a stable, prosperous peace. They also reflected American values. The children fed, schooled, and medicated by Americans grew into leaders of democratic, prosperous nations that became close U.S. allies through the Cold War and beyond. Nations once bitter foes, Japan, Germany, Italy, became partners for more than 70 years. This was not accidental. It happened because soldiers like Danny O'Brien, Mike Kowalski, and Jim Finnegan, acting on directives from leaders such as Douglas MacArthur and Dwight Eisenhower, grasped a crucial truth: how you treat people matters, especially when they are your enemies. On the 70th anniversary of the war's end in 2015, a Japanese TV crew visited Yamada and found the school still standing and still in use. The original building had been preserved and renovated as living history, and behind protective glass hung the mural Danny O'Brien had painted 70 years earlier. Japanese and American children playing together beneath a rainbow. A woman of 93 who had been 12 when the school reopened told the camera she remembered being terrified when the soldiers first arrived and being hidden in the forest by her father. When they returned and saw Americans building, not destroying, giving back their school and their future, she said she had lived a good life because of the education that followed and would die grateful. In Boston, shortly before his death in 2018 at age 95, Danny O'Brien was asked by his great-granddaughter what he most prided himself on. After building hundreds of houses, raising 3 children, and a 68-year marriage, his answer was a small wooden school in Japan he had helped rebuild in 1945. That, he said, gave kids a future, and that is what matters most. The Yamada school story teaches something basic about human nature and conflict. War need not end in vengeance. Enmity can be transformed, the cycle of violence broken, but only by deliberate choices and by acts of kindness that sometimes seem irrational in the moment. Why would soldiers who had just fought a brutal war spend 6 weeks rebuilding a school for former enemies? Why share food with people who had recently tried to kill them? Because they understood, often instinctively, that true victory is not simply battlefield success, but winning the peace that follows. Ichiro expected death and found humanity. Hiroshi expected cruelty and found chocolate, baseball, and care. Yuki Nakamura expected ruin and found a rebuilt school better than before. These were not accidents, but choices by individuals and by a nation. America could have chosen revenge or exploitation. Instead, it selected reconstruction and investment, demonstrating that democracy meant more than mere military dominance. It meant affirming the dignity of every person, even adversaries. That decision yielded long-term benefits. Former enemies became reliable allies, and children taught in rebuilt schools rose to lead free and prosperous democracies. The peace secured after 1945 grew through sustained goodwill, not continuing violence. In a world still riven by conflict, terrorism, and endless wars, the episode of American soldiers rebuilding a Japanese school might seem quaint, but its lesson endures. How you treat your enemies shapes what comes after the fighting. You can prepare more enemies or open the door to peace. The soldiers in Yamada had demonstrated power and then chose to reveal their values, using that power to build rather than only to destroy. That choice, multiplied across thousands of towns and cities in Japan, Germany, and beyond, helped forge a post-war order that, imperfect as it was, prevented another world war for decades. The lesson from Yamada is simple and profound. Treat your enemies with dignity, and they may stop being enemies. Ichiro emerged from his cellar on September 8, 1945, expecting death, and found American soldiers who fed his grandchildren, rebuilt his village's school, and exposed the lies of propaganda. He anticipated conquerors and instead met builders. He expected cruelty, and instead discovered chocolate, baseball, and carpenters, working with Japanese laborers to create something better than what war had destroyed. Ichiro lived long enough to see great-grandchildren graduate from that same school, educated in peace and free from war's burden. This was more than military doctrine. It was American character, a belief in universal dignity, and the conviction that true strength shows in how you treat the vanquished. The Rainbow Division left Yamada more than a school. They left hope, a future, and proof that even after history's darkest wars, humanity can prevail. Do you have a family story from the American occupation of Japan or Germany? Did grandparents or great-grandparents experience former enemies becoming friends? Share their stories. Those connections are the foundation of peace we often take for granted. Next time, the German POW at Camp Concordia, Kansas, who expected torture and instead fell for baseball, Johnny Cash, and apple pie, returning home determined to rebuild Germany as a democracy.